Today, we're going to talk about how accepting responsibility will cut through delusion and misconceptions. How to respond to challenges in a way that will increase your personal power. And lastly, how to send the project of your dreams. Everyone, welcome to Chapter 3 of the Rock Warrior's Way Summary Series, Accepting Responsibility. So the question is, how will accepting responsibility cut through delusions and misconceptions in your rock climbing? Arno starts off by saying that in this society, we are conditioned to not take responsibility. And he gives a few examples of people complaining that trails aren't marked as hazardous, that people are suing one another for coffee that's too hot, for floors that are wet, and that the government is requiring people wear seatbelts. Now that last example seems a little frivolous, but it's not, because it goes along the theme that somebody else should tell me how to be safe, and that I somehow unconsciously then accept the idea that I'm not responsible, which is a very dangerous idea. Arno goes on to talk about how the ego starts to rear its head here in taking responsibility. If we had a night out, we drank too much, it's easier to say, hey, I drank too much, I'm hungover. Of course I'm hungover. I drank too much. But it gets more difficult when there's more features involved, when there's people involved, when there's observers, or better yet, when there's emotions. These things will cloud us because the ego is very meticulous in choosing its battles because it doesn't want you to know how it works, he suggests. And because of that, we may find another way to blame the external world for our shortcomings, in which we are somehow not responsible for. He goes on and gives an example about somebody playing basketball during lunch, that they sprain their ankle and they're out for 6 weeks. They go on, maybe they blame their boss, maybe they blame the coworker who invited them. They just blame, rather than focusing that energy on healing, on getting better. And that's how you cut through the delusion and the misconceptions, is by accepting responsibility and using that energy, which is a motif in this book. Focused attention, that energy wisely and consciously. How many times have we shown up to Jujitsu class, gotten tapped out all night, or maybe we just can't get the throw right in the manner in which we want? We said, oh, no, I had a really long day. My kids kept me up all night. Work was really tough today. How many excuses do we have for not performing our best? Rather than just saying, I'm not at my best today, and that's okay. Accept where you're at. Accepting responsibility for your current skill level cuts the delusions in half, that you should be better, and that you're wishing in a future that doesn't exist because you're here now. How many times in our relationships do we deal with taking responsibility or not? So I'd ask you these questions as you were growing up. Were your parents taking responsibility? Your friends taking responsibility? Your partners? Society? Where in your life have you let others take the responsibility for you? Arno goes on to say, choosing not to accept responsibility for your situation keeps your attention focused on blaming and wishing, rendering you passive and impotent. Those are powerful words. But remember, Arno, I love you, but we said we were going to eliminate not from our vocabulary completely. So if we had to rephrase this sentence, I would say something like this. Choosing to accept responsibility will keep your attention focused on reality and a future you can control, rendering you active and empowered. Arno gives a cheeky example of this as him and his friend climbing, and his friend and his arms too were too short, and his friend kept saying, oh, my arms are only 2 inches longer. My arms are too short. So many examples of him complaining about his arms being too short until Arno finally snapped and said, your arms aren't getting any longer and the route isn't getting any shorter. So accept it. This seemed to snap both of them into the reality of the climb, and they were both able to complete it. But by focusing on things we can't change, the parts of the external environment that we have no control over, no efficacy over, we bleed our energy into them. But when we choose to accept the reality that the hold is far away and my arms are short, something changes there. Something almost magical happens, because I believe we integrate better with the world at that point, and we can see the reality and accept what's before us. In Jujitsu, this happens all the time too. People saying they're not strong enough. People saying they're too small. People saying they're too big. Think of any number of reasons for yourself. In relationships, the same thing happens. We focus on a reality that doesn't exist. Oh, they don't talk enough. That's not the reality. There is one place that I believe radical acceptance first truly took root in me, and that was in ballroom dancing. Because being a good leader, everything is on you. If I don't make the move with intention and confidence and good direction, the follower will have no idea where to go. And if they do mess up, truly, it's on me, always. We ask ourselves, how do we face challenges and increase personal power while rock climbing? Arno likes to go over the pitfalls that happen before offering us a solution. We're going to talk about those. Detachment from reality and wishing behavior are some of the two worst ones, as they lead to a vile place that he describes as victim thinking. This is a place where you have no efficacy, no control, and you are helpless. Energy channeled into this area will not serve you to become better. You may have heard people on the rock saying, oh, I wish these holes were larger. I wish I was taller. I wish I was a baller, a little bit stronger. Whatever it is. But channeling energy into these fantasies is not letting you meet the reality. It's keeping you away from it. It's shielding you from it. Most likely because the reality is going to hurt. But when you choose to accept the responsibility, we're somehow set free. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Arno talks about some of the challenges that happen when you attempt to describe things objectively. The first thing is we unconsciously lie to ourselves. He gives an example of someone's house being broken into. The individual says, I'm going to go downstairs and make sure everything's okay. It was an unconscious lie because he expected to find nothing when in fact he could and actually did find a dangerous situation before him. So eliminating those unconscious lies to yourself in rock climbing, really assessing fall potential, really assessing whether your pro is good or not, makes a big difference. Justification is the second one he talks about. How we justify our actions. He gives the example of someone working at a corporate office and likes to take pens or stamps or whatever and says, well, I work really hard for this company, they owe me. And he suggests that cleansing these little lies out of your life will renew you. And how do we do that in climbing? How do we do it in jujitsu, in relationships? We justify our behavior. We justify the things we do on the rock, maybe by how strong we are or aren't, how we were feeling that day, whether the dragonflies were mating that season or not. Lots of different reasons. In jiu-jitsu, in relationships, it's all the same. So I ask you, how do you justify your behavior in those areas? Are there ways for you to step up, to own more? The last thing he talks about is tricking yourself. And he gives the example of someone climbing who's at a crux and says, oh, I'm just going to envision a bolt right here. And at first you think, maybe that's a good idea. It'll help reduce my stress levels. I'll feel more confident. I can focus on the climbing. But it's vile in a very subtle way. Because when you are truly need to assess the fall potential for if it's dangerous or not, and you're envisioning fake safety, you could find yourself in a world of hurt and a world of trouble. And he goes on to give us an example of this at Stone Mountain that we'll get to later. As you're attempting to describe these things objectively, he gives 3 more ideas about how we can avoid being non-objective. And he says that associations is one of them. Metaphors is another. And memories, another. Associations may be rock climbing is scary, crack climbing hurts, things like that. Metaphors could be crack climbing reminds me of wounds. And lastly, memories. The things that came up in the past that are now plaguing your current reality. And he wraps all of this up by saying that these can contribute to phantom fear. Perhaps we don't know why we feel afraid, but it's a nagging sensation that bugs us as we're climbing. So when you go to assess the route, and you go to assess the fall potential as you're trying to describe objectively, how do we do it? We don't use value words for one. Those holds look good. Those holds look beautiful. Guys, we don't want to hurt the rock's feelings and say those holds look bad, but we use objective terms such as those holds look flat. They look about 4 fingers wide and about a pad deep. Those knobs look like something I could step on. I think I can pull on those crystals. That looks like a good rest point. I see 2 crimps next to each other. Maybe I can get a side pull on one of them. Those are objective rock climbing features. Saying a climb looks good means nothing. And that, all of that, is how you respond to challenges to increase your personal power, because you're meeting reality. You're not plugging energy into a fantasy or wishing or anything else. You're facing what's in front of you and describing it objectively. Arno concludes this chapter with analyzing the challenge. And he says there's 3 parts: the route, the fall, and the climber. The routes he goes on to describe and help you understand how to assess them objectively. Don't say it looks blank. Find the features in it. Find all the little holes and the little dimples that may allow your feet to stick. Describe it using non-judgmental terms. Don't use good, don't use bad, don't use lovely. Use terms that if another person had to view the route in their mind, you could describe it to them. If you're describing a jug, my fingers were able to reach over the entire thing and I was able to crimp them like this. If you're describing a crimp, I was able to get 3 fingers on the crimp and they went about half a pad deep. That is objective. Saying, oh no, it was a really good crimp, is not helpful. What do you mean by good? Think about that. He goes on to talk about the fall. Don't describe your falls in terms of fear. Oh, I'm going to be really scared if I fall. Oh, this is really going to suck if I fall. No, assess it objectively. If I fall, I'm going to fall about 8 feet and land on a solid piece of pro. And if you're up there questioning your pro, well, now you have a new thing to work on, placing better pro. Respect the gift of life. Arno gives the example of him climbing here in North Carolina at Stone Mountain, where he was on a 5'9" and wandered onto a 5'10", about 50 feet above his last bolt. Because of this, he was in a situation where he couldn't assess the fall potential anymore. He was stuck, and this was the first clue to him that assessing fall potential was an important aspect of climbing, because now he was forced to deal with the consequences of not assessing the fall potential. If he had assessed it, he could have chosen whether or not it was worth the risk, because you can always come down and climb another day. Alex Honnold, one of the best climbers in the world, came down on his first attempt of free soloing El Cap. If that man on film has enough humility to back out, I think that should all give us pause to consider the routes we're climbing and respect our gift of life. The last part is the climber. Don't waste attention, energy, focus on coulda, woulda, shoulda, he suggests. Find out what skills need to be improved. The 1,000 heads of the ego are going to rear themselves. Find them, stamp them out, accept them, and move on. If you're getting burnt out on juggy climbs, you know what to work on. If you can't hold on to crimps, you know what to work on. Don't bother blaming. Don't bother wishing the holds were bigger. Go to the gym, create a plan, and get focused. We do it in Jujitsu, and we do it in relationships. We are, in all 3 of these things, the only constant variable. So focus your attention on things that you can control, that are internal. Now, I know some people may disagree with the quote I'm about to read, but think of this more as a philosophical implication than anything else. In the Bible, in John, there's a quote, because the spirit who lives in you is greater than the spirit who lives in the world. I believe this quote really exemplifies our own personal power, that there is something special within us. But we have to choose to accept it. We have to choose to work with it and accept responsibility for the actions that we do take and the excuses that we give and the wishing that we want, so that it can be integrated and we can move on from it. Because it gets to our last point of how to send the project of your dreams. How do we shirk blaming, wishing, denial, excuses, all the things that we went over? How do we get rid of them? Accepting responsibility. I know you want a quick fix, but I'm sorry. That's the best we can do as humans. Accept is a key word here, Arno says. We accept responsibility in order to claim power. John Long in the introduction said life is hard, and we are once again greeted with that phrase. When we accept responsibility, Arno says, we grow to accept a greater fact about our existence, that life is hard, and sending the project of your dreams is also hard. But when we take responsibility, we are set free. We are set free to embrace and learn from challenges rather than deny or blame others for our shortcomings. We allow ourselves to find peace with these difficulties rather than wasting energy and our own personal power trying to escape them. Accept. Thank you guys, and I'll see you next week for Chapter 4.